Welcome to this evening's webinar. The focus of this evening is transitioning from higher ed spaces, public school spaces, parochial spaces, charter school spaces into independent schools. We are hosting these webinars on behalf of the New York State Association of Independent Schools as a way to increase the number of informed candidates to the NYSAIS Job Fair to promote diversity, which will be held on Saturday, February 20th, 2021, from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. virtually. You will have the opportunity to meet with and interact virtually with over 70 independent schools in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut areas throughout New York State. So we welcome everyone who is interested from other points north of Westchester, New York City, and Long Island. We are also thrilled to be able to connect with you nationally wherever you are. We hope this webinar is helpful for you. I'm excited to invite you all this afternoon to a conversation with three colleagues that I value incredibly and appreciate deeply. They are colleagues from New York area independent schools. In a moment, the format will be they will introduce themselves, they will talk about where they work, in what role, for how long, and from where they transitioned. And then we have a bunch of questions. It may be conversational, which is always bonus. Those of you that are live, if you have a question that you would like to ask, feel free to enter it into the chat, or you may also unmute yourself at a given moment and ask the question live as well. So without further ado, I will formally introduce myself. My name is Liz Fernandez. I'm one of the members of the NYSAIS team working on the NYSAIS Job Fair to promote diversity. This is my 21st year in this role. I was hired through the job fair. It is a very important program that seeks to increase the number of teachers and administrators of color within our schools. I'm very, very excited to introduce you to our panelists today. Take it away, friends.
You want to go, Jason?
My Southern sensibilities were going to say that the lady should go first, but I'm happy to do whatever is good for now. Hi, everybody. I am Jason Ford. I am currently the middle school principal at Trinity School here in Manhattan. I have been in that role. This is my 4th year. And prior to that, I was the assistant principal at the Ethical Culture Fieldston School in the middle school there. And prior to that, I worked for a year at a charter school. And prior to that, I worked for several years at a public school in Houston, Texas, which is where I'm from. So I'll pause there and then allow the others to introduce themselves.
Yeah. You want me to go, Samika?
I can go. Hi, I am Samika Smith-Williams. I am the Director of Diversity and Equity at Packer Collegiate School in Brooklyn, New York. I've been at Packer now for 14 years, and I've been in this role for, this is my 5th year. Sorry, I was like, how many? 5th year in this role. Before that, I was a classroom teacher in the lower school. And before joining the community at Packer, I worked at a charter school as a classroom teacher and a dean of students here in Brooklyn at a community partnership charter school. And prior to that, I taught at both another independent school and a alternative elementary school in East Harlem. Eva?
I'm Eva Vega Old. I'm the Director for Equity and Community at the Town School. I've been in this role at Town for, this is my 5th school year. And prior to that, I was in higher ed 12 years. And then before coming to independent schools, I was doing civil rights, but I'm creating anti-bias education content for a national civil rights organization. So I guess you could say like I was doing education, but from the training perspective and training New York City, national public schools, charter schools, educators, administrators, school boards, and that kind of stuff. So I'm really happy to be here with you all.
Thanks. So one of the things I mentioned is that I was hired through the job fair. In addition to working with NYSAIS to host this event, I also serve as the assistant head of school at the Ethical Culture Fieldston School in New York, where I have been for 16 plus years. And so perhaps there may be some questions that I might be able to answer in that capacity as well. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'm really excited to engage our panelists in, just an opportunity to reflect on their experiences. So first and foremost, can you help us understand what is an independent school? What are they? What makes them unique? What makes them different to where you were previously? And if it's helpful to you all, I'll say, Samika, can you start, please?
So I will start. Independent schools are just that. They are independent of the New York City Department of Education in lots of ways. They have their own board of trustees. They have their own operating budget and will at times, I believe, receive some assistance from the state with regards to textbooks or what have you, but that's really minimal. And that's more about taxes being paid and money being kind of distributed to independent schools. Independent schools have it where they're hiring practices and the retention of teachers and other school professionals is really dependent on the head of school, which is the individual responsible for, kind of approving all hires, approving curricular changes, and being the conduit between the board of trustees and classroom teachers, operational staff and families and students. The one other piece that I guess I would add here is that the curriculum, almost similar to like a charter school, the curriculum is really kind of put into place and articulated by the school itself. So there's a lot of autonomy there in terms of what is taught or how it's taught or the approach taken. Though I've found over the years that people bring with them kind of their experience from other schools and apply that to kind of how they teach or the layout or structure of their classes. But really there's a lot that the schools can kind of dictate and determine for their own school community. And you'll find that most independent schools have their own separate mission statement, which is what is usually used to guide and direct much of the programming and the focus of the school community.
Jason, is there anything you'd like to add?
That was very comprehensive. I think the only thing I would add in terms of my own experience, having been at a public school and then a charter school, when I got to the Ethical Culture Fieldston School, which was my first independent school, I was floored by the amount of resources that the school had. And so in terms of being a teacher who needed to ask for things for my classroom, whether it was technology, whether it was being able to access specific professional development opportunities, there was really a lot more than I expected in terms of things that were being offered to me that were very easy for me to ask and receive versus having been in a situation before where people were very budget conscious and often it was, you're developing your own curriculum because you had a textbook that may or may not have been good 10 years ago when it was first used, but now we need you to create and develop the lessons on your own. So I genuinely felt a little bit unprepared actually for the shift that I made from the public and charter world into the independent school world, just based in terms of the amount of access that was provided to me, both financially and in other ways through the independent school world.
Can I jump in? And yeah. Sorry, I would just say, added to that, Jason, I appreciate your, I was kind of framing it out in this way, and I appreciate you talking about what are some of the differences. And I guess one thing is that there are, I don't even know how many schools, I think there are like 90 schools, maybe in the New York State area itself that are connected to NYSAIS. And each of them really does have a unique way of kind of approaching instruction and the systems or structures, or if they have deans or if there are division heads versus principals. Like all of those things are also, I think, huge differences for independent schools. And while there are still assessments and other tools that are used inside an independent school, there's also a way in which they're not necessarily those that are used by the state, but really kind of operated and implemented through individual organizations.
I can just add one other little thing is
Please.
that interestingly is that each independent school has its own culture and community vibe. And there are independent schools that have a culture and a vibe that is extremely formal and traditional. And then there are some that are more progressive, more kind of community centered and less, and has more flexibility. And so like, that's something to discern. So and the other thing is that independent schools, when they think of themselves as private schools, sometimes that term is used, but sometimes people shy away from using that term because sometimes when they think of private schools, they think of parochial school or like Catholic school, which is different because there's a status and a certain relationship that parents have to expectations of what you get for the amount of money that you're funding, you're investing in your child's education. So there's a different vibe there. And so independent school is probably a term that is more embraced than private, although there's some schools that don't mind using that term at all. And so I'll just say that.
Thank you. NYSAIS has actually nearly 200 schools and about 115 in the New York City area alone. So it's important to note that our schools have been around for many, many years, and some have been recently founded within the last 20. And so there is some variety. And the only thing that I would add to what my friends have just said is that some schools are identified as pre-K through 5th grade or K through 5. Some are through 8th grade. Some are considered continuing schools. So they'll start with either pre-K or kindergarten and continue through 12th grade. And for many of our families and for many of our students, they start fairly young and continue through whatever the endpoint is for the schools. They may be single sex or multi-gender schools. They may be schools that have a religious affiliation or not in some cases. And while it gets a little bit complicated, if you're interested, curious in what this means any further, I invite you to check the NYSAIS website or to send jobfair@nysais.org an email, which would come directly to me. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you to be more specific about an independent school if you continue to have questions. I'm curious if you panelists could share what made you consider independent schools. So Eva, you started in higher ed, you were doing training, you were doing civil rights work, you were in the education field, just working with a different focus specifically and with people of different ages. So what made you choose an independent school?
Well, I was looking to remain doing education work, anti-bias education work, training work, but I wanted to be a part of a community in-house and help nurture change along. And I think that was a driver. I think at the time, to be honest, my husband was working at an independent school and I wanted to be on the same vacation schedule as he. So I'll be honest, that was a piece of it as well. Because the vacation, well, it's a little less for teachers. It's a great, you have your summers off or whatever, but I'm an administrator. And so I'm a 12-month employee, but spring breaks we had together, holidays we had together. And then just a really generous vacation package was something that I was really interested in having. But I think for me, it was about community the most, to be a part of a community, nurture people along. And so I joined this school, the school that I'm at, which is a really small community. Yeah.
Thank you. Jason, how about you?
It's interesting. I as I said, started in public schools. And so I taught my first 3 years at a public school in Houston, which is where I'm from. I then moved to this part of the country. And so part of that conversation was around wanting to remain in education, wanting to make sure that I was giving my best to kids that looked like me and who needed to see people who looked like me in my role as a teacher. I taught 7th grade math. And so I wanted initially to stay within the public system. I ended up, though, finding the job at the charter school that I worked for a year. And it became very clear to me through that year that the longevity that I had hoped for in education wouldn't be sustainable if I remained in that position. And so I was working 14, 15-hour days during the Monday through Friday week, but also then spending a lot of time on the weekend, developing lessons, writing lesson plans, submitting those lesson plans, and then having to do extra things. And so after that year, I had a friend who had been here in New York who suggested that I look into one of the placement firms. And so he opened my eyes again to the independent school world here. And so really for me, it was more about making sure that if I were to remain in education, I would have a better sense of balance in my life so that I wasn't only doing work. So that was the main driver for it. And then, the thing for me that was also appealing was that, going from a situation in which I had 20, 25, 30 kids in a classroom to knowing that the average class sizes in independent schools were 15, 16, made a huge difference because before I didn't feel like I really got a chance to know the kids that I was teaching. I was just sitting in front of them and delivering all that I could. But then certainly once I got into the independent school world, I realized that the connections and the ability to form relationships with kids was far greater than I had ever experienced in one of the other schools that I was working in.
Thanks, Jason. Samika, how about you?
Sure. For me, I grew up in New York City. I am a New Yorker through and through, and I went to public schools from preschool all the way up through 12th grade. And so when I started my career, I did student teaching in public school, had an internship that led to a full-time teaching position in an independent school, which I was grateful for, but also felt like I wanted to, like Jason, be in spaces where there were students that looked like me, which is why I went to the charter school world. One of the things that I found appealing about working in a charter school was that I had real say and agency as a classroom teacher in terms of thinking about curriculum and thinking about community and thinking about connections with my colleagues and for our students and families. And as I moved from being a classroom teacher to being dean of students, I found that I was really exhausted. I was becoming a new mom. I had been married for a couple of years and honestly felt like I was putting everything that I could give into my classroom, into my students, into building out programming for related to student life, and I found it really satisfying. But I also, again, really felt like I have been kind of tapped in the sense of being able to feel like I can contribute as much as I wanted to the community and still reap the benefits of feeling like I was a part of community and feeling satisfied with my work choice. A friend at that point suggested that I maybe consider looking at an independent school, and I did. The position is wild. That the position that I had originally applied for is a position that I'm in now. Though when I had applied, they had already kind of felt like, well, we've started this process, but we do have kindergarten open, and so I was like, I'll try it. And so I applied. I was 8.5 months pregnant at the time. Applied for the kindergarten position, demoed, and as I was moving through the community and connecting with various employees at the school, feeling like, maybe this will work. Maybe this is what I'm seeking, in the sense of that sense of connection and the ability to kind of have control or some say over what I'm teaching, which again was why I was drawn to charter schools in the first place. And so I was offered a position and I never turned back after that point.
Thanks, Samika. Thanks all of you. So what advice would you offer candidates who are considering a transition from either higher ed, charter, parochial, public schools? What are some of the transferable skills that you would encourage them to highlight? What are some of the important tidbits that you would offer to help them be successful in their process? Jason.
From the classroom teaching side, because the experience that I had both in public schools and charter schools, what was fascinating to me also was that coming into an independent school, I didn't fully understand the number of people that were working and teaching in independent schools that didn't have formal education backgrounds. And so I had spent time getting certified in Texas to be a teacher there, going through a school program to make sure that I could do the things that I was going to be doing in the classroom. And yet that's not quite the way that most people in independent schools access their teaching jobs. A lot of people come either through second careers, they've already done something for a while and they've come back into the classroom, or they have a level of expertise that they've gotten based on their coursework, and then they have found ways that allowed them to get into the independent schools. So I think for me, ultimately highlighting your classroom teaching experience, if you have it, is always helpful. But you wouldn't need to do the things of like stating how many of the kids that you taught passed the state exam, because I also, taught math. And so it was very important for me on a year-to-year basis to make sure that the kids that were in my class were able to pass the test. There's not really that's not the focus or the drive in independent schools. So there's no need for that kind of statistical analysis that you would provide perhaps in another type of institution when you're going into independent schools. The other thing that I think is really important for independent schools, and we'll probably speak to this more later, but certainly know what kind of a school you're applying for and tailor your application to that specific school, because there are a wide variety of types of schools. And so being able to show them that you are also willing to do things outside of the classroom, because that's another thing that we in independent school look for. We look for people who are going to be really good in terms of working with our students in the classroom, but we also want to know that you can advise a group of students, or that you're interested in taking overnight trips with them, or that you are willing to lead a club or special project with them. So all of the things that you have in your background, putting those forward in a way that is very easily accessible in your resume will be very helpful.
Thank you. Eva, how about you?
I'm thinking about the school year, this school year that we've just had, which has been really different. And one of the things that I think for myself, as we're, interviewing folks, it's like I'm looking for folks, or we're looking for folks who are open and interested in being collaborative. And when it's time to be autonomous and to become a self-starter, and identifying that there's a gap, to fill it, right? Somebody who's going to have initiative, and who's going to do it in the spirit of team. Just because this past year, I think that's something that's always interesting. And in my school, we have grade teams, particularly in the lower school. And so that's a deeply connected group of 4 people, right? There's 2 head teachers per classroom. And so we want they don't have to be exact mirrors of each other, but they should set an intention to stay as closely aligned as possible, while also embracing, individuals' creativity, innovation, passions, right? And so for me, that collaborative piece, that creativity piece, that resilience piece, to have nice crisp stories and examples in mind that demonstrates that. And as Jason said, or I think we've all kind of mentioned, that our schools are different, and there are some schools who thrive, their whole jam is like tradition. And so, when you say the word change, like they said change, they're not going to embrace change, right? So it's also to think about what you lead with in terms of like what school that you're going to be applying to. And I think lastly, I think it's important to talk about discretion. When you're have a nice example about when you needed to use discretion in whatever role you were in, a teacher, because there's a possibility that a child may make a mistake, and this is not something that they want to know, that that who to talk to about it, where to get help and support, but it's not necessarily something that you are putting out there. And so I think that's a really important element. It sounds very strange, but many of the families that are in our schools are high profile individuals. And so like, it's just what we do to demonstrate discretion, and to stay in, and to have families feel like they can entrust their families with us.
Thank you. Samika, anything you'd like to add?
Sure. I think about what each of us has shared, in the sense of like what attracted us to the schools, or into independent schools. And, I think community and working with students that look like us, is something that I didn't necessarily associate with independent schools when I first started looking at various places. And I think it's something to hold on to. Eva just mentioned that, thinking about kind of what you lead with, I would almost take a step back and think about like, what is it that you want or what is it you're looking for, and making sure to hold on to that as you approach schools, and really thinking about what evidence have I seen of these goals for myself in terms of community that exist in my process, right? So whether it is what people are saying as they're interviewing you, looking at their website, how do they talk about community? What students are they showing on the website? Recognizing that like there has been some real pushback from our kids about like, don't just use me as like a tokenized person in every of these shots, like all of these shots, but understanding that like demographics, and data around kind of like what the racial diversity or socioeconomic diversity or representation of kind of various zip codes or whatever it is that you're looking for, being sure to look for that as you're looking at schools as well. The other thing that I would say is, I think I second guess myself sometimes, having moved from a charter school world, being a certified teacher, right? Like those are actually like impressive notches to have both on your resume and just in terms of your own like dopeness. And I think it's worth holding on to that. Right. It doesn't mean that, going into this space, there wouldn't be opportunities to learn, because I do think that there are opportunities to learn. But I think recognizing that you've had to navigate really, tricky kind of spaces and policies and programming at times, and that you've had to do it sometimes on your own. And so the idea of being in a community where you're working on a grade team or you're working, on a common goal, but really having, I think, teacher skills, as Jason highlighted, is important to hold on to as you enter into the process, but also as you move, as if you were to take a job in an independent school, to hold on to that as you transition from being in other sectors to working inside the independent school world.
Thank
Can I just
you.
add one other little thing?
Sure.
Like if you are going to work with children or, young people, like, I don't know what grades you're interested in either teaching in, or even if you're coming in for an administrative role or specialist role, we want to know that you love children, and we want to know why you love the children and the developmental kids, the space that you want to teach in. So if you like the NK space, tell us, be clear about developmentally why you love them and how that translates into your work. And the same as the middle school, right? That's a unique space. Be clear about what it is about, middle school kids that, like that makes you sparkle and shine, and why you get up and do it every day. So like that to me, like bespeaks discernment, but it also be like, you'll be in good company when you land in the developmental space that you want, not just a job, right? Because if you're a third grade teacher and you end up in a sixth grade teacher, you may be bummed out, right? Because those are different animals. They're yummy in their own way, but may not be the same kind of yummy you want. So be able to speak to that and be jazzed about it, because most of us are super nerdy about our kids because we love the developmental age that we're teaching or we're spending our time with the most. So I'll add that.
Thanks. You've all three of you have started to allude to the hiring process, and I know that the three of you, with your in your roles at your respective institutions, are part of the hiring process, and we can have a conversation about what the hiring process was like before COVID and what's the hiring process since. And for the purposes of this particular webinar, I'd really ask you to please focus on what the hiring process has been in this high flex, hybrid, remote structure where we are de-densifying across all of our schools, prioritizing everyone's health and safety and well-being to the extent possible, which means we are minimizing some of the ideal moments that we would normally have as part of the process with bringing people in, having them meet with multiple constituencies, teach a demo class, et cetera. So what has changed? What can candidates expect from a hiring process during this particular moment? And if you all could speak to things like the teaching demo, why are people meeting with so many different constituencies? What should people be prepared for? I mean, the Zoom exhaustion or the Google Meet exhaustion is real. So things like, sort of that nitty gritty and also the high level part of the process, since you're all intimately involved in hiring. Samika, can I ask you to start? Eva, you'll be on deck, and Jason, you'll bring us home.
Sure. So, I think it starts with the cover letter and resume, right? I think sometimes when we look at resumes, we want to see that people have experience interacting or working with families, that they are able to collaborate on the team. What kind of initiative have they taken? Less about kind of like, oh, I've assessed or implemented the ELA or, DRA or whatever kind of those acronyms will stand for, but more about like, I've had to implement assessments, right? Like I think thinking more about task and less about kind of the names of those different tasks. The other piece is a cover letter really is expected, I think, for all of our jobs, in the sense that they don't have to be wildly different, but they do want to know that you can speak to one or two parts of your joy for teaching, your joy for working with adult learners, whatever kind of the position calls for. Being able to really put yourself out there as saying, this is something that I do because I love it, or I do because I love a good challenge or whatever it is. But I think communicating out to schools, who you are and why they should consider you for this position is really key. Also looking at websites and thinking about, again, as you're perusing different website pages, what stands out to you that makes you curious about being able to pursue a job in that particular school, right? Like I think we're a little like caught up on ourselves, like egotistical, in the sense that we want to know like, well, why Packer, right? Like, what is it that you saw that made it so that you said, I want to send my information to that school. I think that goes a long way. Once resumes and cover letters are received, you on the flip side of that is usually a committee. It may be two people, or it could be a couple of people kind of going through those resumes and determining which candidates feel like they should be brought in to pursue the job. In which case you may have a screening call that is maybe about 5 questions that can cover everything from what is it that attracted you to the school, to name a moment where you felt like you had a set plan and were ready to go, and there was some sort of obstacle that or something that fell through, and how did you bounce back from it, right? But they're like a quick kind of conversation that just allows for school leadership to have a sense of who you are as a candidate, and how you then compare to some of the other individuals who have expressed an interest in those roles. I'm going to stop there, but it's important to note that depending on what position it is, at times there are I don't know, like, 40 or more resumes that are received for one single position. And so being able to kind of set yourself apart from others is important. And it doesn't require like jazzy kind of, bells and whistles on your resume. Sometimes that can actually be a distraction, but making sure that the resume and cover letter have it where they are, like a serious spell check, right? Have a friend look at it and be able to give you some guidance about what may need some more clarity. But just really kind of being able to highlight who you are and what it is that you can bring to the institution. And that's like the first part. So I'll stop there and pass it over to Eva.
Yeah. Just to link a couple of points that were made, like Samika was talking about some of the acronyms, right? And like Jason was talking about how a lot of people in independent school are coming in sideways from other areas. That's the reason why you want to zoom out from the acronym and say what the spirit of what that thing was, or say it in a different way, because it's possible that somebody reading that is not going to know what you're referring to, and might also infer this person is too public schoolish, right? And like, and they may rely on their bias in that way. I will add that this year was a tough year for a lot of teachers in independent schools, right? And there were teachers who do not want to be physically in a building, and they don't have a choice, because we need to be physically in a building, particularly for the youngest learners, right? Like it's untenable for families, and it's untenable to really translate, our curriculum. I'll speak for my school, to translate my school into a virtual setting when it is so collaborative, and it's hard to be collaborative with 6-year-olds on Zoom, right? So like there are a lot of factors there. And so what we don't want to hear is that we don't want to hear a teacher come in, a candidate come in and say, I want to come to your school because you're meeting in person. Because it's possible that we won't be meeting in person when the numbers go high. And so we are on a dime, dropping everything, picking up our laptop, our iPad, our cords, and pulling school online, because that's what we need to do. And so like there's some teachers who want to be only virtual, and some teachers who only want to be in person. And what we want is maximum flexibility, maximum creativity, and maximum orienting learning to the needs of children, and not through the prism of adult needs, which is something that is hard to hold. And so I just want to say that this year is going to be, from my take, is going to be a really big year of teachers leaving the school that they're at, who are already in independent schools, being, like kind of bummed out by like the choices administration made, and maybe going to other independent schools. So there might be even more applicants, is what I'm saying. But that means then some people leaving schools because they're, not happy with school anymore because of COVID and how difficult it was. So like stay positive, like have the most like optimistic, loving orientation to whatever challenges that you had. And especially if you can translate your optimism and hope, that like whatever it is that you're doing the best that you can with what you can. Like be excited about all the new technologies that you learned, maybe because you had to, and maybe it was imperfect for a long time, but like how exciting it is every time you get to like realize there's a new bell or whistle, that update that came up, and now that's going to make your teaching a little bit easier, because that's kind of a little bit of what's going on. So I would definitely, I don't even know if I added anything new to the discussion. I'll just punt to Jason and I'll tap back in. I'm sorry. But that's what I'm noticing. There are we have a lot of candidates for some of the, and they're coming from other schools, from other independent schools, because, the grass is always greener, but it's COVID. There's no green grass.
It's all COVID grass.
It's all COVID-y grass.
But are they demoing at your school, Eva?
Yeah, we're having in person, full mask, small, like a smaller than usual group. So maybe they may have 5 kids in the room. So a lot of space in it, but we're doing all of the screenings are online though. And then the finalists, they're trying to really be clear about how many finalists they want to bring in, but yeah.
So the finalist step, and I'll jump in there because depending on the school, once you've gone through the process of doing the first screening, which is likely these days going to be on a video conference call, when we decide to bring in teachers specifically, and I mean that it will vary from there depending on the position you're applying for. But if you're applying specifically for a teaching position, independent schools tend to want to have you spend at least half a day with us because we want to give you a good sense of who the school is, and we want to give you as much exposure to as many people as we possibly can. So what we will normally do is arrange for you to come in. You'll get to meet with people in the department. You'll get to meet with the division head. You'll get to meet with somebody in the Office of Equity and Inclusion. You'll get to meet with people probably on the same grade level team that you might be associated with, depending on the level of school that you're going to be joining. You're going to have a demo lesson. So the schools, I mean, we currently are not bringing anyone in physically in person because the only people that we're allowing in our building are those who are already employees. So when we go through the hiring process, our demo lessons are actually going to have to be people teaching kids on Zoom, which is a new thing for us. But I think ultimately part of this is that we do know that at some point it will likely be the case in the fall that you'll be teaching on Zoom. So it's a transferable skill for sure, so that we can see how it is that you are able to teach kids using the technology that you have access to. I think one of the challenges in this process is that it certainly is very helpful as both a candidate and from the school side to be in physical proximity to people, because I think you gain a lot from being in a school and understanding the culture and understanding the ways that you see adults interacting with kids and seeing kids interact with each other. We are trying to do our best to give as much access to some of those features in the virtual world as we possibly can, but there are just certain things that we can't quite replicate in the same way. But certainly it is the case that when you prepare for a demo lesson with the kids, you do want to make sure that you're highlighting all of the many things that you have learned in terms of the skills that you are putting to use, whether it be breakout rooms, whether it be certain games or things that you're using to interact with them. And then it's certainly the case that once you have done all of that, there's the follow-up piece that comes next. And Liz has cued me to talk about the fact that when we are in schools, we'll have the conversation around salary after you've gone through all that process. And most of our schools don't have public salary scales that you can access before you get there. And so a lot of the process that you'll go through will be you going through this process to understand what the school is like, for you to get a sense of what the school, how the school runs. Most schools that I've been in, the head of school is the person who ends up talking through salary negotiations with teachers that are being hired. And so the head of school for us is the person who runs the school. He is our superintendent, I guess would be the best analogy for that position. And so he basically is the one that will be the one that signs off, sets up the salary. In many cases, you will get a chance to have a conversation with this person during the process that you go through in terms of that visit. And then the questions that you might have in terms of benefits and other things like that can be answered through that person as well.
Thanks, Jason. Samika?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing about the hiring practice itself. In lots of ways, because we know that things aren't traditional this year. It's okay to ask if you can maybe take a tour of the building during off hours. Some schools are providing that kind of access so that you can actually see the space and think about like what the classrooms look like, right? Like kind of look at the library, look at the classroom library, look at the materials that are available. There are also some instances where people are asking if they can maybe sit in on a class that you've already taught, right? So like it's not a matter of demoing for students at our schools, but thinking about sharing a recording or something along the lines of a classroom experience with students that you already have a relationship with has been used in various ways in some schools as well. And so I think it's important to find out from each school kind of what their process is. And I just want to echo Jason's point about like most of the salary conversations don't happen with classroom teachers or with even the division head or principal of the division. Oftentimes those conversations do solely happen with the head of school or with like the business office if that's who you speak with and that's their process. And I think just keeping that in mind is important. The one other thing is you will oftentimes have an opportunity to meet one-on-one with teachers or other community members. And so I think it's really important that you think through any questions that you may have about the school. And while they can't oftentimes answer like 10 questions, there may be 3 or 4 questions that you want to run with in terms of just getting a sense of how people are experiencing the community and what it is that you are stepping into. I think that that's really helpful. But it's important to just keep in mind that it's not a ton of questions, but really thinking about, okay, I'm meeting with a teacher who teaches on that same grade level. I want to ask them about their interactions with students, their interactions with families, the unit that they are most excited about, right? Like there may be a couple of questions that give you real insight in terms of how they live and experience that school community.
Thank you. Eva, do you have anything to add? Nope. One thing I do want to encourage everyone to consider, and it might seem like a really small thing, and yet it's something that I think is noteworthy. When you interview, normally I would encourage people to send a handwritten note as a thank you, as an acknowledgement. And in this day and age, when some of us may not be entering our schools on a regular basis or mail might be delayed, et cetera, acknowledge that you've gone through a process and at the very least recognize and send a note to someone. I think that can go a very long way just to acknowledge the experience that you've had and that you remain even more enthusiastic as a result of meeting with a variety of different constituencies, or something that you noticed, or a conversation that was worthwhile. Those moments of kindness and consideration, I think do go a long way, particularly as so many individuals, all over the world are really feeling a sense of disconnection because we can't be in community in each other's company as we normally, have been. I am going to end with, just the opportunity to ask those of you that are on this call, if you have some questions that you would like to pose, you can do so in one of 2 ways. You may unmute yourself and ask the question, camera on, camera off, your preference, or you may type the question into the chat and I'll ask the question out loud. So this is your chance you may ask a question to a particular panelist, or you can ask anyone who's moved to respond to your question. So here you go.
I have a question.
Go for it, Max.
And it's for Ava because she's worked in higher ed. So I come from a higher ed background. I am looking for work because the higher ed industry is not doing really well. What advice would you give to someone transitioning from higher ed to K through 12 independent schools?
That's a big question. I guess it would depend on what it is that you're interested in doing. I would say, some of my peers and colleagues in higher ed are doing, particularly who are experienced at fundraising or marketing or just kind of general auxiliary support, parent engagement, orientation development, graduation, convocation service ceremonies, and things like that. There are lots of roles that is, I think, really transferable in that way. Making the jump from an office position in higher ed, say student development or student affairs, into higher ed may be a little bit a harder jump. It's possible if you had, it's all about the developmental level, really, to be honest, right? But my school's is a pre-K through 8th grade, right? And so there could be like, if you work in higher ed and you work with a lot of different colleges or whatever, there may be like uh school counseling, not school counseling, admissions, exmissions, helping kids to get into colleges and so on and so forth, or working with, like, if you had freshman experience working with first year students or freshmen, you may be able to like translate that down to like an upper school, high school position. I would just be really thoughtful about what it is that you want to do, the kind of work you want to do every single day. I mean, if you worked in higher ed and you were a math major in undergrad or graduate school, you could say you want to get back into math and teach math. I mean, because that's something that that's the kind of zigzag that many people who join independent schools may do, right? So being able to apply what those skills are into this, you just need to probably know what nuanced position you want to take.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do in higher ed?
I'm sorry, what was that?
What role did you play in higher ed? Like, what did you do?
Oh, that's a good question. So, my first two jobs in higher ed, I worked in institutional effectiveness and assessment. So, I loved your like reaction, like that.
Communications department, right? We're always trying to gather data and evidence that we want. So that would be great. I don't know. Does anybody think of another segue from a role like that? For me, I think it's advancement, the Office of Advancement for us, where that would be.
Yeah, I've been looking, like I mean, those are my first two full-time jobs, but I do have like I have touched a lot of different areas in higher ed, such as like alumni engagement, admission. I was very involved in undergrad and graduate school, so I'm keeping my options really open because the pandemic has made it very difficult because of that.
Okay. Yeah, I think communications feels like a good place, particularly if you're a good writer, a good editor. Those elements, and in those offices, everybody does everything, including we need another hand to teach, to proctor English and Spanish today. So director of alumni, get in here, right? Because this is what independent schools are right now. So, which is kind of cool.
It's a wonderful example of, team. You alluded to that earlier, Eva, and the need for all of us to really just be in collaboration and support one another through all of this. Other questions from you? Camille.
Hi, everyone. Well, thank you for this tonight. I actually come from a background, I work with a community-based organization through NYU, where I'm a college advisor for students in New York City schools. So I'm currently at a school in Queens. I am also studying counseling right now. So I was wondering, y'all spoke a lot about teaching in independent schools. I was wondering if you had any information about like the counseling perspective, even if it's college counseling, and how I would be able to potentially transition into a role like that in an independent school.
Our high schools, very many of our high schools have very robust college placement offices and college counseling offices. So that's certainly an area that would be a very nice segue for you. There are people, I think, at least at Trinity even, who had higher ed experience on the other side of it, that it translates very well to doing the job for high school kids looking to go into colleges. So I do know that has been a transition that numerous people have made in our office. If I can plug it, I believe we just posted also at our school a position in that office. So you're certainly welcome to look there. But also, if counseling is another one of your areas, there are many schools that also have a robust counseling department. And in recent years, a lot of us have been looking at not only school psychologists, but school social workers and school counselors to come in to help do some of the lifting around mental health in our schools.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Okay, so last call. Okay, I just want to be mindful of the time. I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank those of you who have viewed this recording. If you have any follow-up questions, please do email jobfair@nysais.org. I want to recognize my colleague Andrew behind the scenes with the tech support. Of course, Jason, Samika, and Eva, really grateful for your continued partnership in this work. Those of you that have joined us live, fantastic. Please consider registering for the NYSAIS Job Fair to promote diversity. Once again, being held virtually on Saturday, February 20th, 2021 from 10 to 2 p.m. That information is on the NYSAIS website. You can also email jobfair@NYSAIS for any information. And I want to close with the following. The stories that our panelists shared this evening were thoughtful, were introspective, were also based on their own individual experiences. They are not speaking on behalf of anyone other than themselves. They are able to share their perspectives because I invited them and they said yes, so I'm grateful for that. I also want you all to be mindful that there are many, many colleagues of color who have successfully navigated the transitions from public, parochial, higher ed spaces and charter spaces to be where they are currently. It is also really important for you all to do your homework. Looking for a job is a job in itself. So as you go through that process, please make sure you visit school websites. Please follow very carefully what you need to submit and how you should apply for a particular position. If the position says no calls, no individual emails, apply through a specific portal. Please respect that as part of the process. I also want to encourage you to look at the NYSAIS website for additional information. NYSAIS also posts positions that have been provided to us by member schools, specifically on the careers link. Again, if we could be of service to you, please do not hesitate to email jobfair@nysais.org. And with that, I hope that you are all remain safe, healthy, hopeful, and we appreciate your interest. Hopefully we will see you virtually at the job fair in a few weeks. Have a good evening, everybody.